It was September 1989, and I was a freshman at Syracuse University School of Architecture. That afternoon, a professor of ours came into the studio and told us we had 2 days to design our ideal house. Now, I came from a fine arts background. I was used to drawing and painting and still lifes and making small ceramic sculptures of bananas and apples. So I had no idea of what to do with this idea of an ideal house. But nevertheless, 2 days, frantically I sat drawing plans and sections and elevations and some very, very lame perspectives, and I put this drawing up alongside 120 other of my fellow classmates' drawings. Now, I was totally taken aback that day because I was amazed at the sheer imagination and creativity that came out on those walls, on those pieces of paper. And then I thought to myself, you know, there are tree houses and there are houses underwater, and there's houses of modern houses and minimalist houses and houses flying through the sky. And then I went back to my drawing and I just looked at it and I said, oh God, what have I done? Basically, I've just redrawn the house that I've grown up in. And honestly, I did not realize it at that time. It was a total shock. My subconscious had just worked overtime 2 days, taken control of my hands, and this is what spewed out on that piece of paper. Typical suburban house, Long Island, New York, aluminum siding, picture windows, moldings on the door, everything, almost verbatim. Now I know at this point, it sounds a little bit weird, but I was so absolutely terrified at the thought that I had done that. Not because I thought maybe I didn't have the skills or the skill set, or I wouldn't be able to get the technical ability to be an architect. I just thought for a moment that, and I realized that I had been basically growing up in this box for 17 years of my life. And this is the first time that I actually stepped out. And that is a very, very scary thought. What was outside of this box? Everything I didn't know. What was inside the box? Comfort, knowledge, everything that I felt comfortable with. So at that moment I knew that was the beginning of being outside of that box and looking at new ways to see the world and the environment around me. Now, Untitled, yes, that's really what I'm calling this talk. Now, I'm very lucky that this realization came at the onset of my architectural education. Why? Because then I wasn't being interested in just getting a degree. I just didn't want to kind of go through the motions and be an architect and then practice for the rest of my life. It actually made me re-question why I wanted to do architecture, and more, what the nature of architecture would be, and what the nature of architecture would be to me and my practice. And now this was the more interesting question and problem that I had to kind of solve. So now I went through a process kind of understanding what I would do, where I would go, how I would go about my work. And this was kind of, in a way, kind of challenge to me to understand ways of looking and seeing the world. So before I even discuss what it is that an architect does and what it is that my practice does as a new idea, we have to consider, well, how do we define architecture? Architecture is defined in many ways to many different people. But for me, what is interesting to kind of think about is architecture as the art of questioning the relationship between ourselves and our environment. And if you think about it in that very broad sense, then for a practice like mine, it kind of works. Because it doesn't limit me to just thinking about architecture, buildings, spaces, but allows me to kind of experiment with new mediums, new forms of creative expression, and also allows that architecture background and those kind of new disciplines to kind of infect each other with their ideas and thoughts. Now, before I get into my work and what I've been doing for the last 7-8 years, let's consider the normal path of an architect. I've devised this little graphic illustration to kind of help us understand. And if you see, there's a red line which kind of darts through the slide. That is a normal path of the architect. It's heading a little bit towards the sun. Well, on the left, we have factors like stress, projects, ego, money, and on the bottom, we have factors like time and space. So as the architect graduates from this tumultuous 5 years of education and settles down to the idea of either being in an existing practice and going through their life, or maybe starting their own practice and doing something with that, the cycle is more or less the same. You get more projects, the projects get bigger, your ego inflates, you get more money, You get more projects, the practice grows, and you keep on going through this endless cycle until you basically reach your ultimate goal, which is the architect hurtling towards the sun, exploding into a fiery ball, and showering the wisdom of 1,000 gods upon everyone and everything around them. And this is really the ultimate goal of the architect. But 7-8 years ago, I really thought to myself, and I was on this path. I kind of followed it a little bit with this dotted line. But I realized that that really wasn't for me. I had forgotten what it was to question the nature of architecture. And I think that's where I kind of started to change my path. I started to fall back down to earth. And I ended up not in a kind of linear way of looking at practice, but a very non-linear, parallel approach of looking at multiple disciplines and multiple practices, which would all be able to network and talk to each other. So we have architecture, we have interior design, we have fine arts, we have, of course, pedagogy and academics, product design, and even filmmaking recently. So let's talk about a few of the projects. For example, when you're giving an interior design project, does an architect always have to sit down and start drawing plans, or think about materials, or think about form? It's not necessary. In this case, a client comes to you and says, we want you to design something for our brand, and we've never done anything like this before, so what do? The first thing I did was actually not go to architecture. I went to a series of images that would inspire me to kind of look at how I wanted to design this project. And what does sushi, Godzilla, a screen, sumo wrestler, bamboo, and the product have to do with the design? Well, sushi is about structure. Godzilla is about dynamism. The product itself is beautiful as an object. The screen is really about material and texture and light. The sumo wrestler is about sumo wrestling. And the bamboo is about light, air, and quality of life and nature. So if you see the design and the images on the right, they kind of all embody ideas that are kind of behind those images. It could be a project which I curated for 5 years for Columbia University's Studio X. Can an architect be a kind of mediator of kind of discussions or discourse on the future of cities? Can they talk between architects and urbanists, philosophers, educators, activists, musicians, historians, and discuss where the cities are going in the future? Well, we did this project in Studio X. It was a kind of investigation into the homeless population. It was called Without Walls. And in this case, the architect wasn't the only person working on this project. The architect couldn't answer all the questions. We had a NGO advocacy, we had research and data analysts, we had photographers and filmmakers that were also kind of narrating and recording this documentation of the lives of people who've been living on the same road for over 30 years in Bombay. The architect just became this kind of coalescer of ideas. And eventually, the installation that you see here was a kind of integration of many different perspectives on the problem. When an NGO comes to you and says, we want you to design something spatial for us for a public installation, but we want you to invoke the kind of creativity and the feeling of a child within you in the piece, it's a very, very tall order. In this case, of course, part of the problem was solved by seeing my son work on Legos when he was around 4 and a half, and I said, why not? This is the best idea. Let's just make a big oversized set of Legos and plop them in the middle of Bandra's Carter Road. So the spatial idea was taken care of, but what about the kind of evoking of that emotion? How do I make people feel like children? Well, I took to the streets with my smartphone, and I basically started making films. And these films are actually embedded within the installation, within the boxes. So you have things like people drawing ideas or imaginations on the beach in the sand. You have kaleidoscopes of things flying through the sky, airplanes, birds, parachutes. You have a butterfly sitting on a flower. And then eventually you have the perpetual making of cotton candy, endless and endless and endless, and what child or adult wouldn't want to have that? It could be a project for the Kochi Museum's Biennale that we did last year. I was very fortunate to work on 2 projects. This was called Happy Medium. It was a public installation, of course. These are all collaborative and mostly in nature, and I love to collaborate with people. Well, can an architect be a kind of urban designer and an artist at the same time? Yes. In this case, what we did was we basically proposed an urban infrastructure, but very playful in nature, that would only be there for 3 months out of the year that the Kochi Biennale was running. And you actually see people using this. It's all made out of recycled material that was bought from the Kochi markets on the road, and then assembled on-site over 3 or 4 days. It circumvents and subverts the idea of what the city is and gives you a new idea of how you manage it. So could it also be about an architect masquerading as an artist? In this case, I was working on research on the idea of home, which for me dealt with the imaginations that people had in terms of how they wanted to live around the world. This basically formed a three-dimensional construct, which ended up as a kind of physical art piece within the gallery at Aspen Wall. It involved drawings and models of ideas of how people lived around the world. Can architectural drawing or even fine arts be a way of architecturally expressing yourself? Yes, I've been doing it for many years. For the last 7, 8 years, I've been doing drawings and multimedia kind of forms of expression and interpretation, which always help me in my architectural practice. It's not just about building buildings, it's about building ideas. These are some of the drawings I'm working on recently, which are called extra architecturals, because they're basically looking at kind of regenerating the idea of looking at everything we do nowadays is with technology. And we make things in the computer, and then we build these things straight from the computer. But what about our hands? What about our eyes? What about our senses, other senses? Trying to bring these drawings outside into the real life. So in short, I think every discipline has an opportunity to expand itself beyond its potential boundaries. And for me, architecture has been one of those things where I've looked at kind of new ways of seeing the world around me and understanding that space. The relationship we have with our environment is changing in terms of the present and in the future at such a rapid pace that I don't think we can define ourselves by one name or one label. Nor can we kind of consider doing one thing for the rest of our lives. If anything, the projects that I've kind of taken on at this scale have allowed me to explore new ways of seeing the world and new ways of kind of allowing myself to interface with those spaces. Now, how many times has somebody come up to you and asked you this question? It's very simple. Hey, so what do you do? And most of the time, my answers are quite varied depending on the situation or the space I'm in. Sometimes I'm an architect, sometimes I'm an artist. I can be a filmmaker, a product designer, I can be an educator and teacher. I'm always a father, I'm always a husband, that's fine. But then what else is there? Well, sometimes I really think about it, and I just rather call myself Untitled.